Hello everyone. Our next talk this afternoon, I'm very pleased to welcome John Charlesworth. He is from Creswell Crags Museum, and he's going to tell us about specifically the rock art, and then we'll have some questions afterwards of any particular things that you're interested in. John can go into. So thank you, John.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on this sunny afternoon. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and keep my talk down to about half an hour so that we can concentrate specifically on the rock art that has been discovered at the Crags back in 2003. And if anybody wants any questions afterwards to expand on the sort of wider history and archaeology of the site, then I'll try and cover that at that point. But we're going to specifically concentrate on the rock art. Now, I have an apology to make because your previous speaker, Erin, had to apologise about talking about a subject which was more recent than you're used to, and the purpose of this being about megaliths. Well, we're going I've got to apologise because I'm going way in the opposite direction, because we're going to be talking about things which are 13,000 years old at the youngest. But it is situated in a cave, in a gorge, made of magnesian limestone. And if I show you a picture of the gorge here, liths don't get much more mega than that. So, now, we at the Creswell Heritage Trust are responsible for the management and conservation of this significant international archaeological site and its natural environment, which is the gorge of Creswell Crags. It's owned by Welbeck Estates, which is actually belongs to the descendants of the last Dukes of Portland, and is still an aristocratic estate. But Creswell Crags, Creswell Heritage Trust is charged with the conservation and management of the crags itself, and also of being an advisory body for the wider magnesian limestone area. Now, that is quite significant because Creswell Crags doesn't exist in isolation. The reason that we have Creswell Crags with its archaeology is specifically down to the unusual sort of limestone that we've got over on the Nottinghamshire-Derbyshire border. Have many of you, I expect being seeing as we're in Derbyshire, a lot of you have already been to Creswell Crags, is that correct? You've been there. How many of people have been into the caves at Creswell Crags? Oh, about 3 of you. Well, so it's a bit old territory for some of you, I think. Did many of you know it way back in about 20, 30 years ago, before it was actually said, oh, right, okay, that's interesting to find out. Now, back in the 1980s, when UNESCO came up with the idea of World Heritage status, Creswell Crags tried to get put onto the original shortlist for World Heritage sites for Britain to put forward to UNESCO to get it accepted, and it failed to get on there, not because of its archaeological significance, which we know is internationally important, but because of the infrastructure that supported it. For 100 years, it hadn't been treated like a heritage site. We had, before we could actually even approach applying for World Heritage status, get the place up to scratch, and that involved setting up the charitable trust, which is Creswell Heritage Trust, and looking at it in its wider landscape. I'll come to the more specific things that we had to do, but going to that landscape, what we've got is a very narrow band of this magnesian limestone which runs north-south up and down the country. It comes out of the ground down here near Mansfield, near a place called Plesley Vale, if anybody knows that. And then it runs up the Nottinghamshire-Derbyshire border and then out into South Yorkshire up here. It runs actually underground, more or less, beyond that point, all the way in this thin strip towards County Durham and then underneath the North Sea. But in our area, from Plesley Vale to Roche Abbey, there are a whole series of gorges, not just Creswell Crags, which have an international significance as far as Ice Age archaeology is concerned. We found at least one cave or rock shelter in all of these green patches here, which are all the gorges and valleys, all the way along there, which have yielded Palaeolithic information and finds. The special thing about Creswell Crags, oh, by the way, and in no place anywhere along this geological feature is the magnesian limestone any more than about 5 to 5.5 miles wide. So it's a very, very thin strip. The thing about Creswell Crags is, though, that we have found there are more caves in that one gorge than there are in all of the others put together. And I was pointing out to Erin that we also have an Iron Age hill fort in one of these at a place. There's Creswell Crags right in the middle. Plesley Vale's down there. Roche Abbey, if anybody knows that, is up there, which has a beautiful Cistercian abbey from the 13th century, parked right in the middle of it. And it's this one here, Markland Grips, which has a kind of a U-shaped gorge, and on the promontory in the middle there is an Iron Age hill fort, which I believe hasn't been investigated very closely by many archaeologists. Now to Creswell Crags, let me show you a picture of the place. Right way, the wrong way. There we go. That's what it looks like. It's quite pretty, as you can see. And we're looking here from the dam end, because it's an artificial dam that's made our lake, towards so we're on the eastern side and we're looking west here. And strangely enough, the boundary between the two counties of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire runs right up the middle of the gorge. So these cliffs on this side here are in Nottinghamshire, and the ones on this side are in Derbyshire. Now, for a very long time, I'm from Nottinghamshire, and for a very long time, the Derbyshire folk had it over us because they had all the biggest caves on their side and more of them. We've got about 24 caves altogether. Most of them are little cracks and fissures in the rock, and they get a number. Some of them are big enough to get a name, which were mostly settled on by the Victorians. So at the far end, on this side, we've got Dog Hole, then there's Pinhole, then there's one called the Arch, which is just a collapsed cave with with the entrance surviving. So if we hadn't put a lid on the top, you'd be able to see straight through and see the sky going through it. But we've put a lid on there to protect the archaeology. Then the largest cave, Robin Hood Cave, and then another one called Mother Grundy's Parlour, where a witch used to live about 200 years ago. She was a real person. Incidentally, according to the word hole actually means cave, so I can't call it, and if I do, you can slap my wrist, I can't call it Pinhole Cave or Church Hole Cave or whatever, because I'd be saying Church Cave Cave. It's a bit like saying Lake Windermere, which is really like saying Lake Winderlake, so you shouldn't say that. They've got all the biggest caves on their side. They've had the most significant archaeological finds, including bits of art relatively early on, mobile art on bone. On the Nottinghamshire side, we had very little. We've got two main caves, one called Boathouse Cave, which is basically destroyed by one of the Dukes of Portland who turned it into a boathouse, and the other one is Church Hole, which is now our most significant cave, which is at the far end on the left-hand side. So they had it over us for a long time, but then in 2003, all of the art to speak of was found on the Nottinghamshire side, you see, so we get the honours back again. Now, I'm not treading on too many Derbyshire folks' feet here, I hope. Now, we have in this gorge had for about 140 years worth of archaeologists working in our gorge, and they were discovering an archaeological record that goes back actually way before the beginning of the last ice age, after about 100,000 years ago, all the way to 120,000 years ago, when it was as warm here as it is in Africa today. So we found hippo bones and narrow-nosed rhinoceros bones in the caves on either side. So we obviously had rather exotic animals from warmer climes wallowing in the stream which goes to make up our lake. After it starts to get a bit colder, then we get the ice ages beginning, and for a long time we get a period of very thick ice on top of us, perhaps 2 or 3 miles in thickness. And then over that period of time you get periods there which start to get a little bit warmer. And during those slightly warmer periods, the grasses and flowering plants that we get in the tundra grow up in the summertime during a brief Arctic-style summer, and that's what attracts grazing animals northwards, along with the people who are living on them. So, that's the right way around. Oh yes, we have a rather complex site. Difficulty with your hill fort sites. Creswell Crags is a site of special scientific interest. Oddly enough, not for its living things, but for its dead things and its archaeology. So it's a geological site as opposed to a biological site. It's a scheduled ancient monument, of course, because of what's been found in the caves, and it's a registered park and garden as well, because it has a small amount of landscaping, and it was part of a great scheme of a great country house as well. And we are now working towards World Heritage status properly for the first time. Let's take you back to the gorge here. Behind us, where this photograph is being taken, until 12 years ago, we had a sewage farm, which doesn't actually help a World Heritage status application. And so that had to be moved. And then the main road went through the gorge itself. The B road, the main B road that connects Creswell with the A60, went through the gorge. That had to be moved as well. So the local authorities, we too have a good relationship with our local authorities, and it helps that we're on the border between two counties because they both help us out. And the local quarry, because magnesian limestone is extremely important has commercial properties. The local quarry felt that it was, in order to be able to extend their quarry, they were prepared to pay for the removal of the road as a kind of an environmental payoff, if you like. So they removed the road in 2007. They made a new cutting behind the cliffs, and the road was moved. And then finally, in 2009, cost of a further £6.8 million, most of which comes from the lottery, we built the new museum there. So now we've got a site, tens of millions of pounds, and about 20 years later, from the setting up of the trust, we've got a site which is now worthy of being put forward to being for being a World Heritage site. So we're putting the bid together again for that. Incidentally, it's not just the significance of the site from a heritage point of view, which is important. It also needs the infrastructure, conservation plans, all of those things in train, which means that it's going to be preserved. And also you have to have a place where you can actually tell the story of it to the visiting public. So the educational aspect of it is extremely important. That is why it needed the new museum. So now we're fit to reapply. Okay, so back to the story of the Ice Ages. From about 80,000 years onwards down, 60,000 years, I beg your pardon, down to about 40,000 years, we get a lull in the cold period. The temperature rises enough to turn it into a tundra-like environment that we get in places like Canada or Siberia today. And we start to get the first signs of Ice Age animals coming up here, the ones that we all think about: mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, and the predators that come along with them: cave lions, cave wolves, cave bears, lots and lots of hyenas, and possibly, although Victorian archaeologists might have tampered with this slightly, a scimitar-toothed cat, or a dirk-toothed cat, which is a bit like the saber-toothed cat that we get in North America. But the people who are coming up here at that time are our Neanderthal cousins. They are not modern humans just yet, or at least we don't think so, which makes Creswell Crags just about the furthest north in the world that we get any Neanderthal activity occurring. So we're right on the northern edge of their territory. Then it gets colder in the 30,000s, about 30 odd thousand years ago. It starts to get colder again. Once again, nothing is living up here. And then after about 30,000 years ago, this is actually really the furthest back that this next warming period can occur. 28,000 years ago is when it starts to get warm enough to get people coming back up here along with those animals. So the tundra environment returns. As you can see, it's a very stylized version of Creswell Crags that we've had made here, but it's not quite that square. But this is a reasonable representation of what it was like. Grasses, no trees to speak of, perhaps the odd shrub, juniper bushes, that kind of thing, which are very sturdy, but no trees, tundra-like grasses, and then people come along with them, and this time they're people like you and I, modern humans. And this continues all the way down to around about 10,000 years ago, when the Ice Age, as far as we're concerned, comes to an end. There's enough snow and ice melted now to turn Great Britain into an island. The English Channel and the North Sea are filled with water for the first time for almost 100,000 years. And at that time, the Ice Age comes to an end, as far as we're concerned. I think, technically speaking, we're actually still in the Ice Age, and this is just a very warm interglacial period. kind of felt like it a couple of weeks ago when it was raining so much. But we could expect to go into the temperature could go either way. Global warming might in fact stave off the return of a new ice age. But it's these people that we're thinking about when we're thinking about the discovery of the art at Creswell Crags that was made, the discovery that was made in 2003. Now you might be thinking, why is it, seeing as we've had archaeologists working in our crags now for about 140 years, it was only in 2003 that they discovered the first Ice Age rock art in Britain. And there were two reasons, really, one of which is it's not very easy to see. So you have to use your imagination when you get there. When I take people round, I have to say it's a bit like looking at clouds and looking for a shape in those clouds, a bit like that great Churchill advert that's on the TV at the moment with a dog lying back in the grass, looking up at the clouds and saying, well, there's a sausage. It's that kind of imagination you need. And when you get in there, you do actually begin to see it, and once you get your eye in, then it becomes more and more obvious. So it's quite hard to see. The other reason, unfortunately, I think, is really down to archaeologists and the sort of academic world of archaeology itself, because basically for 100 years archaeologists were taught by the universities that there is no Ice Age rock art in Britain. So basically there was nobody looking for it, and there was quite a large psychological barrier to overcome before the first archaeologists could see it. And it's only because a dedicated team of 3 archaeologists got together who suspected that there ought to be Ice Age rock art in this country, and they went on a specific expedition around the country in order to try and find some. And the result was the find that we got at Creswell Crags. Oh, I don't know why this picture is so cold. It wasn't that cold all year round 12,000 years ago. But this is roughly the time when we think our art dates to. In fact, we're pretty certain that it dates from between 13 and 13,500 years old. And I'll go into how we know that in a minute. But this actually shows it was still pretty cold, even it's only 2,000 years before the end of the last ice age. And what this shows is that there is some evidence to suggest that people were coming up here a little bit earlier than the summer melt in order possibly to trap Arctic hare while they had their winter pelt still on them for fur. And there's also a suggestion, because Creswell Crags has a kind of funnel shape, it's that you could actually seal one end off with a net and drive the Arctic hare into the net. So quite a stretch, I think, probably, as far as the evidence is concerned, but it is feasible. Okay, yes, I'll come back to that maybe in a minute or two. This is the... Where are we? There we go. Okay, so this is the team that found the art in 2003. Now, the short gentleman on the right-hand side, that's Dr. Paul Pettit from Sheffield University. The one in the middle, in the blue, is Dr. Paul Barn, who works out of Hull. He lives in Hull. Now, the fact that he lives in Hull is actually a vital piece of information as far as the discovery of the art is concerned. And the one crouching down there is Dr. Sergio Ripoll, of the University of Madrid, who's an expert on the painted caves of France and Spain. The one in blue is a Portuguese gentleman who came along on the 3rd visit of the team. And I always thought it looked a bit like a refugee from Guantanamo Bay in his orange outfit. And he has a very, very long name, and so we tended to call him Paco for short, because it was a bit easier to remember. But that was the team who discovered it. And the first time they came was around about, I think it was February 2003. And they had in mind to visit Kent's Cavern in Devon and Cheddar down in Somerset. We weren't actually on the top of their list. The only reason that they came to us was because they were starting from Paul Barnes' house, and he lives in Hull, and we're on a direct line between Hull and the southwest of England, and they were more or less coming past the front door, so they called in almost on the off chance. They were there for 3 days, and if I just take you back to the other main picture that I showed you, oops, there we go. This Nottinghamshire side is north facing, And the Derbyshire cliffs that are behind those trees on that side are south facing. So even in the Ice Age, it was several degrees warmer on that side than it is on the Derbyshire side. And as a result of that, some of the most major finds that have been discovered were found on this side, including, strangely enough, some pieces of art. And I've got a couple of examples, copies of the art here, which I'm going to hand round now. These were found in the 20th century, but probably the most significant find was found right back in the early part of archaeological discoveries at the Crags in the 1870s, and it's a piece of prepared rib bone with the head of a horse engraved on it and coloured in ochre. So there's a kind of red pigment inside it. So I'll hand these round. One of them is got a piece of two pieces of geometrical pattern design on it, and the other one has a human figure, which is either really, really badly drawn, or it might possibly be a human figure with a hood on, which may be a shaman in the process of going into some sort of trance for a spiritual purpose. So if you wouldn't mind handing that back, that'd be great. Thank you. I'll hand that round. So what obviously that shows is that we knew that people who were up here in the Ice Age summer appreciated art, understood it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were the ones who actually made it, because they could have traded for it where they were living further south, in France or Spain, places like that, and then brought it up with them and just lost it at Creswell Crags. What's excellent about the originals of that, by the way, are in the British Museum, so we've only got copies at Creswell Crags. What's great about the art that was found in 2003 is twofold. First of all, it shows that it is actually the people who are up here in the summertime in the Ice Age who are making it, and it is of the same style as the painted caves and other forms of engraved art that we find in the Ice Age record across Europe. So they are they're exactly the same people, or they're certainly of the same culture of the Ice Age people of the rest of Europe. And the other good thing about it, of course, is that this time the British Museum can't pinch it, so we get to show it to people while it's still on our walls in the cave. So 2003, they came round and they started to explore on this side, on the warmer side, because that's where the most significant human evidence had been discovered to date. And for 2 days, they looked very carefully in each cave and they didn't find anything. They went over to the opposite side on the final day of their visit, and they were being shown around there by the then curator, who'd been with the organisation for about 30 years, knows everything there is to know about Ice Age animals, knows the caves backwards, forwards and sideways, find his way out there in the dark, had never seen any art at all. And he was showing them around on that day, and he walked into Church Hole, which is about here, down there. He walked into Church Hole and with Dr. Ripoll, and he said, "This is north facing, it's a less pleasant place to stay. We found fewer evidences of human occupation here. You're unlikely to find anything in this cave." And Dr. Ripoll said, "Yes, except for that ibex I can see carved up near the ceiling on the left." And it was almost as quickly as that, with his trained eye, that they found the first piece of evidence. And with that one discovery, this team of 3 had completely changed our opinion of what people were doing here in the Ice Age back 12 or 13,000 years ago. As I said, they went on to the other places and they didn't find anything out there, so they came back again and they had a closer look, and by the time that they'd left, they'd found between 12 and 20 pieces of art. Actually, you have to be fair to the Derbyshire folk, because they found 3 on the opposite side as well, 1 in Robin Hood Cave and 2 more in Mother Grundy's parlour. But the vast majority of it is in Church Hole. Now, they came back again when they'd actually made a press release, and the media got involved, the BBC came, etc., etc. They actually did a live broadcast on BBC 6 o'clock news from there. But they came this time with a much more sophisticated team of experts in lighting. We put a platform in there in order to get them back up to the level that the floor was in the last Ice Age, so they could get closer to the art. So they were using things like laser mapping, infrared and ultraviolet lighting, those kinds of things. And by the time they'd left, the Spanish contingent believed that they'd found about 120 pieces of art, nearly all of it in that one cave church hole. Now, It was actually quite an exciting time to be there at the time, because we'd be doing other things, community projects, that kind of thing. And then a head would come round the door, and Dr. Ripoldi would be saying, "We found another sixth." And so it was every morning there'd be a new discovery of 3, 4, 5. I think the record must have been about 12 in one day in this one cave. I'll come back to the quantity of art in a moment, but let's have a look at some of it. Forget the right one, going in the right direction. There we go. Right. Now, I borrowed this slideshow from somebody else, and she's gone a bit Rolf Harrisy on us, and she's saying, "Can you tell what it is yet?" Now, this engraving is actually quite an interesting group, because it's very far into the cave from our point of view. It's not as far into the cave as some of those painted caves in France and Spain, but it's got to be about 20 to 25 metres inside the cave, down a dark tunnel. The vast majority of our art is very close to the cave entrance. It's no further from the cave entrance than I am from that gentleman sitting at the back row over there. It's all in an area which is actually lit by external light coming in from the outside. This isn't. So you're going to have to crawl down in the darkness and lie on your back to do this engraving. So here we've got, and I'll go around it and then I'll show you what it looks like. So what we think we've got here is a group of wading birds with their heads pointed up to the sky. Can you see the point of the bill just there? And you come down its head, very thin neck. There's no body, it's just a head just there. Can you make that out? And there's another two there, one superimposed over another, and another one in the middle that's got a bill a bit like Daffy Duck just there. Now, that's what they think they look like. I can't actually see the eye myself, but they reckon there was several more there, but I can only make out two birds. Now, the reason these are wading birds is that there's no trees to perch on to speak of, so in the Ice Age, the birds that you find are normally water birds. And we'll come back to that one in a moment. But that's the kind of thing you're looking for. Many of them are engraved outlines, but what we also have, apparently, is the most sculpted ceiling of any cave known in the Ice Age world. The archaeologists got so excited about it, they started to call it the Sistine Chapel of the Ice Age, which is going a bit far, but it was a measure of how important they thought that particular find was. So what's happening here is they're using something like, as we'd call a burin now, which is used in etching, with which would be a piece of flint in their case, with a kind of bullet or pencil point. And because this magnesian limestone is actually relatively soft, it's quite easy to carve lines into it. So they're carving outlines of animals very carefully into the rock. As careful, well, you have to be careful in the darkness here. Right. Now, on this surface is the first one that they found, and this is actually quite big. It doesn't actually give you an impression of how big this animal is. It's about as far from here from the edge of the screen to about there. So it's actually quite large and about so high. It covers quite a large area of this part of the wall of the cave. And this is either a red deer or a reindeer. We're not quite sure. It was identified as an ibex, which is a kind of mountain goat originally, but it's the engraved outline is here. I'll turn the next slide on so that you can see it, and then I'll go around it. There we go. Ignore all the other lines. Just concentrate on the black outline there. So that is the front of its head is here. The horns or antlers are going on there. There is its ear. You come down the back of its neck there. Then there's lots and lots of 20th century and 19th century graffiti on this wall, so you have to ignore that. Follow the line of the back of the animal. You come down its back leg just there, and there's its belly. And there's a very pointy front leg, and its chest and its throat, and back up to its mouth again. Now, these points are actually quite significant, and I'll come back to those in a moment. But what we do have as well underneath this animal, I'm not quite sure why they've done these in pink, but I think that it must be associated with a grazing animal like this. There are some lines there. These are in pink here. Can you see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, we don't know what they mean, but the style of that animal, the way that it's figured in a kind of static, restful profile, particularly with these pointy legs, which are actually quite a feature of Ice Age art, And these lines here, underneath or to the rear of grazing animals, are very similar to the kind of ways these animals are depicted in the rest of Europe, particularly in places like Altamira, places like that. They have these, often in the manganese oxide pigment, these lines underneath the animals. We don't know what they mean, of course. Some people have suggested it might be a tally of how many they've killed. Other people think it might be the grass that they're grazing on. I had one woman on one of my tours about 6 years ago when it was very, very cold, and she saw these 3 lines here and wondered if it was the same as the star rating on your freezer. So you could stick a reindeer in the back of the cave and come back a year later and it'd still be fresh to eat. Now that's it's a bit out there as a theory, but the reason I mention it is, of course, we absolutely don't know. The Ice Age people, like the Bronze and early Iron Age people, didn't leave a written record, and their culture has long since been absorbed into everybody else's. So all of these theories are possibilities. Now, how do we know it's 13,000 years old, which is a bit of a clincher, given that these caves have had kids going in and out of them now for about 100 years. The grills only went on the front of the caves in the mid-1970s, so there's a century of local children coming in and using it as their backyard. In fact, we still get some of the older people in the area complaining that their kids can't go in and play in the same way that they used to when they were children. So it could easily have been faked, I guess. It is quite handy, isn't it, that halfway through our redevelopment of the site, working for World Heritage status, that we suddenly discover this incredible discovery, which is very unique. Well, it can't be very unique, but you know what I mean. Now, so how do we know? And it's down to stalactites, basically. That is the clincher. In a number of places, stalactites has begun to grow over the top of the engraved lines. One of them is around about here, which covers some of these lines here. You can see that white sort of cloud-like mark coming down. That's covering some of those lines. And on here, over here, there's some more, and that has a line going up the wall. You can't see it on this photograph, but it goes over some other engraved lines that belong to another animal. And we all know stalactite takes a huge amount of time to grow. Even better than that, you're all used to carbon-14 dating. You can actually date it in a similar fashion because there's a small amount of uranium in it. So they use something called uranium series dating. They've taken two samples away from a less sensitive area. They've taken it from underneath the overhang of this bit just here and just over here as well. And the lab in Oxford has dated our stalactite at 12,800 years old. So obviously the art that's underneath it is a bit older, and they've recently looked again at the evidence. We originally thought it was about 13,000 years old, but they've recently looked again at the evidence and they've published a paper suggesting that it might be slightly older. Only a matter of a few hundred years. You can say that in Palaeolithic archaeology, only a matter of a few hundred years, and it doesn't really mean a lot of time. But probably somewhere between 13,000 and 13,400 years old. Right, I'll come back to if there's time at the end, I'll come back to all this superimposition in a bit, but I want to show you some more. Now, let's have a look at the ceiling. What we've got on the ceiling are bas reliefs which stand proud of the rock. And what we think they're doing is they're using that kind of cloud technique. They're looking at the way that the light and shade plays on the surface of the cave and using their skill, once that's suggested a shape to them, to bring that animal or bird out. So here we've got another bird. This time it's an ibis. You've only got the head here. The half of the body isn't on this photograph. But an ibis has a long pointed beak which curves downward. And so that is the top of the beak there. There's a long nostril in the centre of the beak which this bird has. There's a curve to the top of the head and an eye in the middle, which doesn't show up very well on this, but it's there. That is the back of the neck there. That's the front of the neck. And then the body is over here, and it seems to have some scratch marks on it to suggest feathering. So there were feathers on it. And that's kind of what it looks like. It's not a very good photo, actually. I don't like this drawing particularly, but that's more or less the shape that we've got. Legs don't do very well in our cave, unfortunately. Lots of them have no legs at all, including this bird here. This is a very, very badly eroded part of the cave ceiling. So they probably disappeared. Or I suggest that because it's a wading bird, it could have been up to its waist in water. We don't know. When the Spanish and British archaeologists discovered this find, they wanted an independent archaeologist to come along and verify what they found. So they sent to France for a French archaeologist, and I've been struggling to remember what his name is, and I can't bring it to mind. I'm sure the initials are MD, but it's going around in my head, and I can't get it out of it. But he came along, and he saw the art, verified that they found art, and then saw this here, which is a bison. That's its shape on this wall here. And he reckoned that's the best bison he'd ever seen. So even given the things that he's used to looking at in France, he thinks that the anatomy of this particular bison is extremely good. So I can't see these lower lines here, but if I go round it, that's the front of the neck just there. Then you've got a very bovine profile to the head, round its jaw there, up its front of its face, a couple of horns on its head, which you can see just there, and then there's a long slope of the back of the neck up to the top of the shoulder, and then down towards its rear, and then its bottom goes there. Once again, the legs have disappeared. I don't particularly, I can just about see it on here, but when you actually see the cave surface itself, you can't really see that line there. But the irony of this is that it may well have been a cow that has destroyed the legs of this other cow, because this cave was being used as a cattle shed in the middle of the 19th century, so there could have been some itchy cows in there that had a scratch and then rubbed some of this out. Ironically, the first archaeologists were cows too, because it was the same cave where they first discovered any evidence of the last ice age, and it was cows that were digging into the floor, into the sediment, and kicked up bones and flint tools, which got the Victorian archaeologists interested. Now, once again, I tried to get a photograph of this again yesterday to bring along here, but I couldn't find the camera before I had to come away. But I'm sure that there's a better picture of this somewhere. But this is meant to be a horse's head, which is my favourite piece of art in the cave. It's on the ceiling. It's on a very flat, excellent surface for doing art. Once again, it's a relief, and it's very eroded, so it's actually flat almost to the surface and very ghost-like. But what we've got here is a horse that's got its head a bit like the head of a knight on a chessboard, actually. So that is the top of its neck just there. That's the top of its mane. And actually, when you look at it, you can see not on this picture, but in real life, you can see there's kind of scrubby marks down there which represent a kind of brush-like mane sticking up on the top of its head. You come down the front of its face there, there's an eye, and which is very much easier to see in real life, and a line of discoloration which takes you down to the end of its nose, and there's a bit of stalactite that's growing in its nostril, and then you come round its jaw and then down its neck just here. So that's what we've got there. That, for me, is the nicest piece of art we've got in the cave. And there are two good things about this, is that the kind of horse record, the bones of Ice Age horses that we find in the caves at Creswell, are very similar to the Przewalski horse, which is a horse that exists in the Asian steppe. It's mostly in zoos now. It's semi-domesticated, but it had a range all the way from Russia all the way across Europe to Britain, and it's the bones of that kind of horse that we find. They're very used to living in very cold environments, so they're very stocky, very sturdy. They've got a very thick neck and a very brushy mane. If anybody goes to a zoo with one in, you'll see that. So on this horse, we've got a very thick neck and this very tufty mane that sticks up on the top of the head. So it seems to me that they're trying as accurately as possible to portray the animals that are living around them. The other nice thing about this is that what looks like discoloration down here, around its eye particularly, and down towards its nose, might not be natural. There's a suggestion that it could be a manganese oxide pigment, which is the blue-black pigment that they use in the painted caves. There's also one engraved line which may contain a little bit of ochre, and we know that ochre exists in art, which we found at the Crags because it's in the horse's head that was discovered in the late 19th century. So both the Spanish and the British contingent believe that this cave was multicoloured at one time, just like the rest of Europe, or the caves in the rest of Europe. And in actual fact, a lot of the European caves contain animals that already have an engraved outline around them. So it's like a preparatory drawing for applying the pigment inside. It's only because our art is so close to the cave entrance that the pigment has had time to disappear and erode away. Now, it is true to say that this wonderful team of archaeologists have made this discovery. They agreed on lots and lots of things, but there was a very big academic fallout when it came to writing it up. And it's not over the fact that the art exists, which we know it does, and it's not because not either of them believe that it's painted, which they both do. It's the quantity that they've disagreed over. And as I said, some of this is very difficult to see. So there's a certain amount of interpretation that comes into it. There's as much of an art as there is a science in looking at these. And the Spanish, with all their Mediterranean joie de vivre, I think there's about 120 pieces of art. And the British, with all our North European cool country reserve, think there's about 20. So there's a huge discrepancy. So they've had to write up their findings separately as a result. I can't even see 20 when I go in there. So when I take people in there, I only show them what I can see and I believe is there. So you are allowed to be sceptical about something, but not all of it, okay? So just briefly to go back, before I move towards the end of it, just briefly to go back to, that's the one I was looking for. This is a plan of what the Spanish contingent of archaeologists believe is on the wall with the original deer on it. I can't see most of these. But I can see the leg of the red deer animal that we've got here. That's quite easy to see. It's a little bit more eroded. It's a bit more faint than the black leg. I can also see this little green wolf sticking out the back along here, which you can just about see. Once again, that's even more eroded than the other two. So if this is all here, what we could be looking at, given the different levels of erosion, is we could be looking at several centuries, if not thousands, of years of work. So there's been time for some of the art to fade out and somebody to come back in and to reapply it and do other bits of art on top of it. Or it could be, and I don't favour this theory myself, but it could be that it, like with some peoples around the world of an animistic culture, it's the actual act of making the art which is more important to them than the result. We don't know what the absolute purpose of it is. It's odd, though, that 90% of the art that's been found at Creswell Crags has been found in one cave. And it gives us to believe, especially seeing as that cave is on a cold side of the gorge, and there were fewer human evidences coming out of that from the Ice Age, it could have been set aside as a special cave for whatever reason. Now, as archaeologists, and because you're interested in the megalithic past, you will know that the fallback position, really, for an archaeologist when they don't know what it is to say it's a sacred site. But which it's probably true in many cases, but in some cases it might just be a mystery. In this case, I think it's relatively reasonable to think that it is of some sort of spiritual significance. It's too coincidental that all of the art across Europe has a certain amount of stylistic similarity, and they're portraying very similar things. And it's odd, isn't it, that this is all in one cave as opposed to being spread out randomly across the gorge. And a clue to what that might be, I'll go forward again, if I can find it. I'll come back to that in a minute as a kind of thing at the end. But a clue to it, on one side of the cave, actually on the opposite side to where the animals are, we get these triangles. There were supposed to be 3 or 4 on one side of the cave. I can only actually see 1, maybe 2. The light changes constantly inside of the cave, so it's difficult sometimes to pick everything out all at the same time. So we get these triangles. It's not very big. It's only about so big. And what they think it is a representation of one of the pieces, similar to one of the pieces that we've got in, the only piece that we've got, in fact, in Robin Hood Cave, which is here. 2 lines coming together as a triangle, one intersecting them. It could represent the vulva, the female reproductive organ. So it might well be a fertility symbol of some sort. Coming back to that, let's go just reverse slightly. Remember I showed you the birds originally, which were way down inside the cave? There is another theory about these, and what this might be, if you turn it the other way up, is it might be the first depiction of the female nude in British art. So what we've got here, the way this works, is that these parallel lines, because she's in profile down one side, these parallel lines represent the torso coming together a little bit to form a waist, and then these curves down here are the buttocks. And if you remember the pointy leg of the deer that I showed you to begin with, that which was originally thought to be sort of a duck-like bill might be the point of a leg coming down here. To understand where this theory is coming from properly, I need to show you the next one, which is here. Now this is a site in Germany called Gunnersdorf, and as you can see, these are two women facing each other. It's much more easily identifiable as a woman. As I say, she's much more Katie Price-like at the top here, and then you get the curves of the large buttocks there, but once again these pointy legs, which are very suggestive of the kind of legs that we get at Creswell Crags. So if I go back and compare them again, you can see that leg coming down, that might well be that, and the pinched waist might be what we've got going on here. Now, I've recently come to a sort of theory about these, in that this is very dark. The Gunnersdorf women are actually in quite a light area, so it's easy to do your art. You're going down in the darkness. If I was doing this, and I'm no artist, but if I was doing this and I was drawing this on a piece of paper, I'd say, oh, I haven't got that quite right, and try and rub it out and do it again and again and again until I got it right. And I'd end up with a whole series of faint lines. I just wonder whether they've had several goes at producing that, if that's what they are, whether they're women. My issue with that theory is that if that's what they are, why are they upside down? It is. So once again, it's a matter of interpretation. And finally, I haven't got a picture of it. Never mind, doesn't matter. One of my favourites nowadays is that we've got a cave bear on the ceiling. I thought I got a picture of it and incorporated it. Maybe I'll put it right at the end. No, I haven't. Sorry about that. I thought I'd incorporated it. But there's a cave bear which is meant to stand really proud of the rock. It's probably our deepest sculpture. And once again, this is a matter for interpretation. It goes in and out of phase, even with me. To begin with, I was convinced of its existence, and then I went off it. And then I'm kind of more and more convinced that it actually exists now. But it's a European cave bear, and it's walking along with its head down. So you've got the entire profile with this large bear's head at one end. But it is using very deep shadow on the cave surface. Now, there was one other thing I was going to say. Oh, that's it, yes. For what it's worth, finally, this is entirely my own theory, that I have got a theory about this particular cave. If we've got fertility symbols going on here, if we've got some sort of rite which is asking for fertility within the animals that they're living on, and also within the tribe that they're living in as well. We think they're living in groups of between about 25 and 30 people at a time, no more than that, which is right on the edge of what is viable as a human community. So it would be actually very important to ask your spirit world, if you like, to provide more animals to keep the people who are alive, who are in existence, and very important also to ask for fertility within the tribe in order to provide more children to keep the tribe going, because as soon as you drop below that number, then you are more or less doomed, we think, to a very, very unpleasant end, I would have thought. So I've got a theory about this cave, in that all the caves at Creswell Crags have a very sort of specific individual character. Some of them are multi-chambered. Well, Robin Hood's a multi-chambered cave. Some of them are just rock shelters. Some are just cracks in the rock. Some are wide. Have got a wide entrance and then a very thin passageway that goes behind it. Church Hole is the only cave that's got a really significant entrance and then just goes straight back into the cliffside, penetrating into the cliffside about 150 feet, slowly tapering as it goes. I just have a kind of an image of a birth canal there, going into the darkness, asking for fertility, and then coming out with that fertility. It's entirely my own theory, and you can have it for nothing. Okay, I'm going to stop there. If anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask, I'll field those. Anybody wants to know anything a bit beyond the rock art, then that's fine, yeah? Okay.
going back to the one that you said with the wading birds.
Yes.
And that one as well, actually.
The horse.
One.
Yes.
The wading birds. I mean, I can't see the real thing now in the photograph, but they, especially the one on the right, which looks like it's got two small ears.
Yes.
That looks to me like a skinny deer or goat.
Right, here, yes, I know what you mean. They do look a bit like their ears from this angle.
From what I was going to ask was, could it be that they're recording the time? So they're saying like, you've got skinny ram, goat, deer, whatever it is there's no grass vegetation. It's like their communication technique. Anybody else there, grandsons, whatever, coming into the cave, that this is what it was like, or this is what it is like here now. Recording history sort of thing.
Yeah, in some cultures, you do get these being used as an educational tool. We think there's a kind of training exercise going on there. I'm not sure whether there's any direct, evidence. What is evidence? But I'm not sure there's any direct evidence that points to in that direction here. There doesn't seem to be any sense of, say, progression through time, if you see what I mean, in the sense of, if it was like, let's take an instructional manual, for instance, there's no sense of going from one state to the next to show a progression, which might be of interest.
Yeah, but you point out triangles, like kind of fertility symbols, which that is a form of language. It's widespread, so it's a form of language, not just depicts as something that's seen. That's what I mean is, are there any other cases where you get similar creatures like these ones? Could it be a form of language as opposed to just a depiction?
It's certainly a form of communication of some sort.
Yeah.
I certainly think that if somebody was coming along who wasn't actually from the tribe, if you like, or the group of people who were producing this, and yet they were from other parts of Europe, they would certainly be able to recognise and identify with it.
Like the Italian marks, this is
yes.
a place or a bad place.
Yes, I see what you mean. That it's an interesting theory, and it can't be ruled out completely. I think what I would say to that, not against it, but is you'd have to think about where you are, in that we're looking at a very, very wide area where the hunting would be very similar across that area. And the fact that we've got these things in one place might actually be slightly misleading, I think. I think we think of caves as being places where people settle. But for all we know, there may have been plenty of people out in the plains living in tents, for instance. We don't know anything about that. And I think that it's some of our imagination that gets fired by caves, and that simply because that's the place where it's easier to preserve the evidence. So I think that to say that the Creswell Crags is a special place in those terms, in the sense of it's a good place to hunt, it's not a good place to hunt, those kinds of things, it's a good place to stay, we might be correct, but it also might be a false impression simply by the evidence that we actually survived down to us. However, it is an ideal place to put a special place, if you see what I mean. And coming back to that spiritual idea, if caves have a cultural significance to them, and some caves have a greater cultural significance to them than others, then a cave is a good place to display your beliefs, so to speak. But a certain amount of you've got to think about stained glass windows as an educational tool for the Bible, haven't you? In more recent times, but it could be serving the same purpose. Yes.
The picture or the image of the ibis, I've always associated ibises with a more kind of a warmer climate. And saying this is like tundra type environment, I wouldn't have thought people they would be aware of.
Well, we do have those kind of wading bird bones in the record, not at Creswell Crags but around Britain. We have all the others we have in the bone record from Creswell Crags, but the birds.
Period is the
yes, that's You see, you're absolutely right. I thought that as well, and it's been identified as an ibis sort of like animal, but it could be some other kind of a crane or a heron, I guess. I'm only guessing, but I do understand what you're saying. But we also have we're also kind of slightly misled by our imagination about what's going on now as well, because we don't think of hyenas as being a cold country animal. I think it's a hyena. You think it's a hyena? Well, what I would say about these images, though, bear in mind that these are photographic representations, and I would suggest, it's like a plug now, but I would suggest that you come along and have a look, because the actual real life thing might lead you in a different direction. The photographic representations are slightly misleading in their reality, if you see what I mean. It looks very real, but it doesn't really look like that. A lot of them don't in real life. We have a difficulty with artificial lighting, for instance. The best way to see the art is simply by natural lighting coming in from the cave ends. In fact, digital cameras have actually helped, because they can actually capture quite a lot more than old-fashioned film cameras. And if you can use it without flash, you can get an even better impression. But you do really need to see it with the light coming in from the cave entrance. Yeah?
On that then, 'cause you mentioned the amount of erosion that's gone on, especially if it's limestone, it's very soft. We found for some of our chambers tombs in Anglesey that had been open to the elements, so a lot of the rock art on them had disappeared, or we thought had, until they were laser scanned. Mm-hmm. So have any of these been found, or an awful lot more been found by the laser scanning?
Well, there's been 2 periods of laser scanning. I don't know quite what happened to the research on the first one. I think that helped to confirm or deny some of the contentious things between the 2 groups of archaeologists, scientifically speaking. But they've literally, over the past 3 weeks, done a bit more. So one of the things that we've got, as you know, as I've already mentioned, flowstone has grown over the top of the lines. And I think the last amount of laser scanning that was done, which was about 3 weeks ago, was an attempt to look through the flowstone and try and detect previously unseen or unseen parts of the art underneath the layers. Because obviously it has to be relatively thin flowstone, but it is, because it's not stalactites that have grown downwards, it's just a film that's grown over the top of the cave. So there's more to be seen. And also, as we thought when this was first discovered, that there's more out there in the rest of Britain. And only about a month or 2 ago, as a paper being published identifying a very, very small, it's not very big I'm afraid, piece of what they think is art. It's more or less been verified on the Gower in South Wales. And that's recently found its way into the press as well. But that, it doesn't mean that we're unique anymore, but that's important, because it shows that Britain was producing this in a number of places, and it's worth looking in places that haven't been looked at before. Yeah.
The art you showed us the bone and
yes.
Does that artwork on the bone, is that later or the same time?
It's around about the same time. It dates to the last part of the Ice Age.
The
Yes.
artifacts that you found, the carvings, help you a little bit more in interpreting. I was interested in the piece of bone there, because the human shape seemed to me when I first looked at it, to have a bird's head. So was it a shaman with a bird's
Yes,
head?
I was saying this earlier.
And then you've got the birds, the ibis theme. I mean, I do understand that some of these ancient shamans used to dress up in certain animals' things and feathers to call on the spirit of the animal for hunting and so forth. So would not the pictures on those bones sort of give you an idea about what might be?
Yeah, I think it probably does. I mean, the kind of relationship, but the distance between the two, in the sense of making that leap of associating one with the other, is something that we have to get across.
So use other mediums to draw it.
Well, yes, and I think that you're onto something as well, because I think in some of those caves over in Europe, they have discovered lines, sort of almost sort of net-like lines that have been placed over images, which I can remember seeing a TV program from a while ago. They were looking at the way that shamans go into a trance, which involves a lot of dancing at night and those kinds of things, but there may even be a drug element to it as well. And as you go into that dance, strange things happen to your optic nerve. And it produces a very similar effect in everybody, in that you get a kind of a sort of light net-like effect going over your head or over the images that you're looking at. And you're quite right. In some cultures, they dress up in a guise which suggests the spirit of the animal which they're trying to communicate with on the other side of whatever their divide is. And I think that you're probably onto something there, but it's making that definite leap. I mean, it is a leap of faith as well as a leap of science. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
It could also be children playing with the bow, learning how to draw, or...
It could be. It could be. I think that a lot of this art is quite well accomplished, so I think that it's very deliberate. It's an odd thing you should mention the children coming in here, because if I just go back to this one... oh, that's the wrong way, isn't it? Sorry, I haven't got used to this yet. Left and right. If we go back to this one, that's right. Dr. Ripoll first identified this as a goat, an ibex, which is a mountain goat, which is odd because we don't have ibex in Britain at the time. It lives in the Alps today. And what he thought were horns did turn out to be antlers when they had a closer look. But of course, a goat's got a beard, and the kids who have been in here since before the 1970s have also seen it as a goat because they've scratched a beard underneath it. You see, that's there. And rather like your Canadian soldier, we know who's done this. We don't know what the name of the person, but about a year after it was discovered, a gentleman came forward and said he was with a group of children. When he was a child, came into these caves, saw this animal and scratched the beard on it, you see. We reckon it's somewhere between the 1940s and the early 1960s. And what's more, he said that they went away and told some adults that they'd found it. So because they were children and weren't archaeologists, and because the archaeologists believed that there wasn't any art in this country, of course they weren't believed. So we could have had this discovery about 40 years earlier than we did. So when I get kids on my tours, I always say to them, just because you say one thing and the adult says something else doesn't mean you're wrong. But then I'm told I'm undermining parental authority, so I don't do that. So do you want to ask a question?
I wanted to make a comment really, it's about the ibis. As we've seen that, and we think it's a bird with a fish in its beak.
Oh, right, okay, yes.
And when you look at it closely in the cave, it's just as if, instead of having a long beak, was that cutting point, and it's just as if in real life, it swooped down and pulled a fish out of the stream. So you've got to look at it for yourself.
Yeah.
And make up your own mind.
Yeah, you get all sorts of theories. I'm not saying you're wrong. That's fine, because it is a matter of interpretation, and you get all sorts of people spotting all sorts of things when you're in the cave, because you start to look at sort of patterns like in a curtain, and you think, oh, that looks a bit like a face or something. But who's to say that you're wrong? I mean, there is one line which people often think is a profile of a horse's head. And it's a ridge, and it's got a crack going down around the ridge, on the edge of the ridge. Now, what the archaeologists have said would say is that is a natural fissure, and I agree with them, it is a natural fissure. But who's to say that the ridge underneath it, with the crack down it, wasn't there, and they didn't interpret that because they were using natural features of the rock, as we know. They didn't interpret that themselves as a horse's head. Even though the later feature, which is the crack, suggests that it's the whole thing's completely natural.
That's what I was thinking about the horse being a hyena. They're the same thing. They didn't know yet whether it was natural or human. And it looks like they've used some kind of... You said it was fossilisation or something on it? I can't remember.
Oh yeah, there's a bit of stalactite that's grown in its nostril.
So, yeah.
Right. For my money, that's a horse. Oh, but I would suggest you come and have a look at it and have another look. Also, hyenas were extinct in this country about 22,000 years ago. So if that art is the same date as the rest, then it could be. It could be, yes.
Just to add to this lady's point about the fishing bird.
Yeah.
In some cultures, not here, but cormorants are used and trained to catch fish.
Yeah, in China they are, aren't they?
But, I mean, we don't know where these people came from. And if it was warmer then, is it? I mean, it's just a speculation.
Yeah,
but, there are cultures that do train birds.
It's all up for speculation. You'd have to take your cormorant with you, though, because you were migrating with the animals.
Or birds similar?
Well, they may have, but that entails a certain amount of domestication, doesn't it? Now, I'm not saying that I'm not here to say that there is no, but generally speaking, we don't believe that kind of domestication had happened by then. Wolves into dogs, maybe, but that's about as far as it goes. There was somebody at the back in the middle, yes.
Compared to the caves in Europe, which are about 24,000 BC, is there any evidence at Creswell Crags of that sort of age of rock art? Or?
No, not yet. I mean, there's a recent report to show that they've discovered some painted cave in Spain, which they reckon is between 40 and 45,000 years old. But certainly from our point of view, we're only certain that the rock art dates to the last part of the Ice Age.
You've got habitation evidence dating back that sort of time, have you?
We've got Neanderthal evidence that dates back to that time. And then once again, we're getting into that grey area of what Neanderthals were capable of doing. It is generally believed that Neanderthals weren't capable of producing that kind of sophistication in art, but once again, that's just a theory, isn't it? So it's a possibility. But we do have a very cold period in between 40,000 years ago and 28,000 years ago, when there's no evidence of life up at the crags, but it's too cold, and it might fall within that time. But certainly we haven't got anything older than 13,500 years yet, that we know about yet. The maximum that it could go back to, I suppose theoretically, is about 28,000 years ago. Yep.
You were saying that this is about the northernmost extreme of Neanderthal findings in Europe. Are you saying that Creswell Crags is the furthest?
Yeah, it's around about this area.
They don't go up into the high peak of...
Well, I'm not absolutely sure. No, they wouldn't have gone there, as far as I'm aware, because the ice cap, as we understand it, around the time when the Neanderthals were here, actually, the Creswell Crags area, that part of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, was actually quite favoured. I mean, it is kind of now in a way, because it's a rain shadow, isn't it? And it's protected from a lot of the westerly winds. But we understand that the ice cap actually came down in a horseshoe hoop shape, sort of around it. So it came down across what is now the Peak District on one side, on the western side, and on the eastern side, I'm doing it the wrong way round from your point of view, but from the eastern side, it came down beyond Doncaster and down into Lincolnshire. But it goes backwards and forwards. You know, we sometimes, as we know, it was iced up, and then obviously later on now, if this still is the Ice Age, it's way north, isn't it? So who's to know whether Neanderthals didn't get a little bit further afield than that?
I just wondered whether there'd been any research into some of the caves on high.
Oh, there has. Yes, there has. And in fact, Dr. Ripoll and his team came into the caves in the High Peak to look for more art. And there was a speculation that they may have found some, and I think it was in the Peak Cavern, I think.
Right.
But that, I don't think that was ever published, because I think that was about the time when we started to get this academic argument going on about what was there and what wasn't there. It's a separate team, I think, that's been working on the one in South Wales, which has taken the heat out of it a little bit, I think. So that might well prove to be correct.
That one in Wales, is that the red, well, it's a red nun, not a red lady, but it says a red lady, and that's in a cave.
Yeah, it's not that close to there.
And they thought it was 30,000 years ago?
Yes, that's right, yes. No, I don't think it's particularly close to that. It might represent something that's entirely separate, we're not sure.
Right. But would that then, put it in context, would that be a similar period to these cracks? Would they, that's earlier?
A little bit earlier, it sounds, yes. Sorry, when did you say the date? Because it's a bit 30,000. Well, yeah, it'd be quite. If it's 30,000, that would be quite cold then. My feeling is it might be slightly older. Sorry?
It was on the coast, so...
No, but it wasn't on the coast then in the Ice Age, because not only was it not. And
there was more land.
and also.
Out into the Irish Sea.
But and also during the coldest periods, of course, the English Channel and North Sea were dry. Lots of the ocean around us was locked away in the ice anyway. The sea level was far lower. Shall I take one more? And then yeah, okay.
Your photographs, are they enhanced in any way?
Not particularly. Well, certainly this one isn't. The one with the horse's head, I think, has been enhanced a bit too much because it actually destroys what you can see on site.
The comparison between what you actually see
And what you can, there were differences. I wouldn't say there were in that photograph particularly. I wouldn't say there were many differences. The horse's head, I think, probably comes out the worst. And the rest are somewhere in between. But the lines that are obvious on them are definitely there. Yeah. Sorry, I took quite a long time. I didn't mean to do that. Okay.
I was just say briefly, I've also seen suggestions of animation on other rock art between those. Do you think there's a possibility of more
Because of that?
Or the different animals, I don't know.
Difficult to say. Maybe, but my feeling about it is we're looking at very, very significant different periods of erosion.
Yeah.
So there was quite a significant time period. But nice thought.
Yeah. Thank you, John. That's given us an awful lot to think about. Thank you. Now we're going to have I think, just a very short break again, so we'll make it 5 minutes and then we'll get John Barnett, who has some, if you think of questions for John about stone circles, cairn circles, that sort of thing, anything you've always wanted to ask.